Johnny Silverhands, gone in 2030. Introduction. This is the last part of Johnny Silverhands' brilliant essay Collapsing Now, gone in 2023. Replicated here on Medium and on YouTube with explicit permission as a separate essay, this basically being Johnny's loose but honest predictions for 2030. I encourage you all to make your own whiteboard as described in the full essay, and make your own near-term predictions. See if and how things played out as you predicted, and how the bias has affected your judgment. Anyways, enjoy. 2030. So here we are at the last bit. We've made it. We're there. If we have talked about the heuristics now, assessed the world through their lens, then we should also be able to apply those heuristics to guess what comes next, yes. If it's useful to us, shouldn't it give us some useful predictions? These will be like my whiteboard example earlier. We should be able to repeat that easily enough, I think. We can really put me and them to the test, because if the heuristic is generally applicable, then, well, it should be generally applicable. So let's apply it. But a couple of notes before we do. First off, I hope it's clear by now that we shouldn't be caught up on a particular system or point or year. We are not going to hold on to any one thing as true or as the causal factor, beyond of course the bias. The whole thing we're doing here is a systems analysis built from taking modern data and just correcting our assumptions about them. And so we should already understand, collapse isn't a year, or a single event, or even a single set of relationships. To put it most plainly, we're not about to predict collapse, we are already in collapse. The collapse has already begun. We know marine heat waves likely started to appear around 2009, and that insect populations were plummeting in 1999. It seems Exxon Valdez anticipated 5°C of warming in 1970. And in 2023, for some reason, the readings on ocean temps jumped up. But none of these is a collapse in and of itself. They're just system fluctuations. A worldwide collapse is just a way of saying multi-systems all undergoing collapse from previous stability at once. And by that definition, this whole document has been showing you that we're in a multi-system collapse right now. And we have been for a while. Heck, the whole reason LTG was able to predict what's happening is that they used business as usual assumptions, i.e. they just followed trend lines from right then. Nothing had to change from 1970 to get to today, they just had to continue. How wild is that? Have you realized it previously? LTG is just smooth lines from 1970 to right now. Once that's digested, let me now point out that collapse doesn't really work like that either. Cascade collapses are non-linear and driven by accelerating accelerants, which means at some point those smooth lines stop being smooth. But that's what this section is, us looking together and seeing, cataloging the wave we're riding. My second note, please remember VICAP and 80%. I know a heuristic isn't formalized, mathematically precise, or hell even the best way to perform a correction. I'm not aiming for the best though, I'm aiming for fast, and still accurate enough to be useful. 80% is also my target, and not my guarantee. I'm not smart enough to get specific on this many variables, but at least I'm attempting it. I am putting in rigor, but we're not in research here, we're in triage. It's time to act like it. Third and final note, you can do this. You should do this too, and often. Science is our basis, and everything should come from a place of empiricism. But remember, science is supposed to be a tool. It is not supposed to have gatekeeping, it is supposed to have verification. So question everything, confront your bias, look at a problem and predict. You actually have a lot more biases and there's a lot more correction to be done. But that will have to wait for now. One problem at a time, the heuristic applied, predictions. It's very easy to just say, everything will be worse going forward. If I'm right about even half of this document and an Earth system cascade is in progress, then that really is all there is to it so far as our old world goes. But I think it's very important to walk through reality, step by step, and see what we're about to do. Acknowledge the fuck-ups. Maybe even put some precision back into the mix just as we try to look wider. So yes, things get worse, but we'll still be getting some surprises too. Our lines won't be smooth. Hopefully this means some things will get better, i.e. systems will show some surprising amount of positive resilience or not be quite as strongly linked as we might expect. I for one think that the main crops corn, wheat, soy, not rice though, can probably still be grown at scale for a long while to come. There will be disruptions to them, entire bread baskets under stress, but actual net production. Yeah, we'll be able to do that for 5 years or so at least I bet, and likely even more. But this is a systems collapse, so while maybe we can keep growing due to excellent farmers, the trucks and the power and markets likely fail, and it won't matter if there's food in the fields when no one can access it. And since each new failure has the potential to cause additional failures, we're going to get compounding problems. Combinations. And this is why I talk about 2030. In our previous review, we noticed a fair number of trend lines converging around 2040 to 2060. You'll remember that was important in the original LTG BAU as well. But that was primary systems only, and my theory has always been that it's worse than we think. So while microplastics alone might not kill folks until 2040 or later, 10% of us sick, combined with 1/2 the oceans too acidic, and 5% hydrates firing probably can kill us, when combined. Years before one thing kills us, many things together will. We're not doing our sums, but let's make some predictions along these lines, and in a few years we can see if I'm right, yes. That's supposed to be good science. And one last friendly bit of advice, don't read these in one go. Take them in bites and do other things and only come back when you're ready. I have often encountered the idea of the first domino to fall, or the expectation that some system is going to fail first in a big obvious way before real chaos sets in. The stock market is going to crater to nothing. There will be a run on oil worse than 1970s. Congress will be dissolved or martial law declared. I assert this expectation is conservative bias. The mind saying no giant event has occurred, so everything right now is fine. I deny this version of unraveling, and while I think all those events will occur, I don't really think the Earth and human systems need a complete breadbasket disaster or worldwide power outage for a cascade to failure. No single new system needs to fail entirely, because so many have failed in part already. Animal life is almost gone now. 30% of 1970s already tiny numbers remain. Hospitals worldwide are in active collapse. Excess deaths are growing. Africa has less power generation than 15 years ago, so it's now peak power. Public research has been gutted. To be frank, the world has already shifted. We just haven't pieced the picture together. The oil well that only needed to go down 20 feet to power half a city is already extinct. So are 200 lb fish in the Chesapeake Bay, gold nuggets just waiting on the ground, corporate pension funds, and small issue elections. And being married to any certain series of events that happen next, or a specific order from them, is trying to do more specific forecasting than I am now without accounting for even 1/10 the items. Consider, if New York loses power first, the Dow Jones may not have a hard crash. If the internet goes down first, you may not ever know if London flooded. Don't get me wrong, I do believe there are predictable specific events coming, obviously. But we must make way for both chaos and our ignorance. So this prediction is that there is almost no linchpin event we must expect. The methane hydrates might not fire at scale, the microplastics might not be a problem in time. Food might be available right up until the end, all because a broad multinational war breaks out first. And please remember, it is not that a system needs to completely end for cascades to erupt from its husk. 20% failure of the AMOC might be called AMOC failure, but in actuality, I don't think most models ever expect the AMOC to cease. It's just that a 20% failure already shifts vital weather patterns, just as 1.5 C seems a small change and yet shifts everything. By this metric then, many dominoes have already fallen, and now we are simply waiting for the entire room of them to tip. Like the LTG, we're waiting for most things to crash, not all. Human societies have a believe what you want crisis growing, i.e., information as a commodity has grown into now the primary business's domain. And as governance there has steadily retreated, the field has grown wild. This is part of why the bias is everywhere. We have the information, but we didn't tame it for a purpose. Science is questioned, but unlike us, they do it unreasonably, as a reaction. Facts not even sought. And thinking turns shallow to the point that article size and sophistication in printed language has been measurably dropping since 1980. All of this is generally known. What's not known is that this process is going to be irreversible at scale. A value statement for governments is that we have them so they can create movement at scale in order to effectively deal with crises, and yet this document has laid out this is no longer true. The future will only exacerbate this problem, and as our crises compound, our heuristics say governments are mostly going to default to faster, simpler, less accurate interventions and assessments. Worse, I'm going to suggest we will actually create additional problems with current governance. Rather than identify our difficulties, many governments worldwide will destroy our information-finding apparatuses. There will be no reversal of complexity decay, an effective rescaling of organizations like NOAA, even when regime changes allow a temporary reopening. Instead, overall government actions will be towards less data, more focused actions on tentpole problems. If analyzed as a statistical field, I think we'll find that throughout the descent to 2030 and beyond, government turnover would be historically high and ever increasing. Likewise, analysis of news media would find a decreasing level of complexity, with even sophisticated articles and deep dives maintaining silos and limited synthesis. Our picture of the world will generally simplify, missing even current levels of connection, and the decay will track almost side by side with the Flynn effect reversal. Microplastics will rise at an accelerating exponential and will be further attached to nearly every biological process disease. This is not because they cause everything, but simply because they are everywhere. The levels in our study were all independent of age of host, which means that it is the plastic itself that's rising, and this tide will have to be compensated for. The reviews we do over the next few years will find plastics are already contributing to diseases today, yes, but we will find specific plant and human thresholds beyond which the plastics cause disease too. Worse, we will find not all fragment types are created equally. Some form of them, or some compound or mixture, will cause more severe illnesses that we will be unable to piece together until it is widespread. That's an easy prediction. So harder, I put plastics and other endocrine disruptors as among the most likely suspects for a universal drop-in. Worldwide male fertility, a phenomenon almost everywhere, rising universally, but also physical in nature, i.e., detectable in related tissues like testes, testosterone. This will be confirmed by similar rises in wild animal populations, and I'd expect at any moment will link. Societal drivers for less children are combining with a decline in natural biological capacity that has been rising for nearly every male creature. A problem humanity has had all along is that if somewhere is hard to see, we don't bother to look. With this guiding star, methane hydrates will remain unknown to us right up until methane shows up in the atmosphere en masse. I guarantee a small amount is already there, and that's assuming it even does show up in large numbers. Given that we have evidence of hydrates both disassociating and migrating now, I'm pretty confident that if we did look, we'd find hydrates have never been as stable as we assumed. And even if they don't all dissolve in the next 50 years, we are going to find a field, a region, a zone that has already been shrinking in the past. By now, it's likely several regions, or will be shortly. Changes to an ocean current, or perhaps to the sea ice structures above it, or even to a local water column will have started a process of sustained release we can measure. This isn't just the localized plumes or hundreds of methane columns we've already spotted. This is an entire field of a single hydrate zone falling apart, absorbed by waters at first, but nonetheless releasing its matter faster and faster. We will likely be able to map one of these by 2030, even if it doesn't all turn over at once, and as the same general chaotic conditions spread through the ocean system, more events will occur. Full methane bomb fears are generally pushed back due to deep sea stability and vast sediment pressures. I challenge these assertions right now. There is some evidence of volcanism increasing due to ice shifts caused by Earth energy changes, and if that ladder of cause and effect can occur, then I say it won't be the only type of actual physical Earth shifting. Reduction of ice on soil and sediment pressures and shifting currents will combine with heat, and to my eyes, this sets the stage not for a general system release at once, but for regions with the potential to transition quickly. Where and when I cannot model, this is chaotic interaction, but I think we'll see something like this soon. It may actually be correct that only 3.5% of total hydrate volume is possible of firing anytime soon. But that alone is sufficient to kill us all, and it is already firing now. And there are still large-scale dynamics to this system we do not understand or even have on our radar, like the potential for physical destabilization, like fracturing and calving of exposed deposits. Unfortunately, methane in subsea permafrost is a bit easier to predict. As the caps at the poles vanish, warmer water and less pressure are going to be the natural result. As the plume in Antarctica shows, there are dynamics to ice sheet loss not modeled, and as sediment and shelf pressures shift, we should expect a spreading root system of methane release. Shakova will be vindicated here, and we will find not only the pluming in her region has continued since first observation, but that it has expanded and increased in magnitude. To be clear, I expect that a good analysis will show greater than 1 GT of subsea methane has already been released, likely all in the Siberian Traps ESAs, and that we will have a larger release before 2030. If we are going to find a sea greenhouse effect, I anticipate it to be first noticeable at the poles, in the waters near or around these methane beds. Happily, Antarctica is slightly less vulnerable due to depths, but we are even more blind there, and when the ice loss here becomes as catastrophic as the North, again, I'd expect to see the loss of most or all sea ice here for the first time before 2030. We'll be surprised by widespread pluming nonetheless. Antarctica ice hasn't receded for a long time, and so the methane reserves beneath it will be massive, as heating at both poles is surging past all predictions by several factors. 4 times as a good estimate releases here will not be few and far between now. I'd in fact expect all methane to disassociate at the poles long before anywhere else, and one pulse can quickly birth its neighbor here, and will do so repeatedly. Right now there will be fields hundreds of miles long releasing, and we will have a complete release cascade at the poles well underway by 20. I'd think, with permafrost on the ground and the seas releasing enough methane that the pole heating factor surges ever higher. It's quite possible this has already contributed to one reason why the poles are so much hotter now, and soon both poles will be our glimpse into real heat lensing effects. As a note, the threat at the poles alone is likely civilization shattering in my estimation. A number of separate disorders, think MCAS, long COVID, fibromyalgia, ADHD, will be found to be multiphasic not just in systems affected, but in causation. An interplay of environmental exposures and pollutants will be the primary cause for at least a few such diseases, and of real importance. The persistent nature of a few of these illnesses will be not because of persistent exposure, but because the exposure persists and accumulates. Microplastics cannot be cleared, only resisted as the dementia brains demonstrated. Some other pollutants will act the same, and even diseases like long COVID that have an infectious trigger may not be as simple as no disease before, disease after. New syndromes and disorders are lurking just below population detection, and when they are spotted, their nature will be a mixture of exposures. Given the rapid increase in environmental factors, at least 2 of these new disorders will be active right now and grow to visibility by 2028 or so. I think demyelinating disorders will show a marked prevalence at any moment, if not already. Everyone gets sick. It's a simple statement and has some recognition of rising risk now in swelling disability, cognitive challenges, ADHD, autism, falling healthy years, etc. What's important in this prediction is that health difficulties become omnipresent at some point, literally in everyone. Alive gets sick with multiple somethings and in the near term. And the human race as a whole will get sicker compared to our past selves, and unexpected deaths will increase as a result. This is a specific prediction that the curves of disability and illness will accelerate non-linearly alongside environmental exposure, and that, given most medical data, is synthesized from 4 or 5 years ago. I expect such a pattern would become increasingly evident should we be able to see the last few years. I bet if someone simply mapped chemical production and population disease incident together, we could couple their rates right out of limits to growth. Someone should do this. It should be noted that the worst implication here is that medical intervention continues to degrade in a way purely outside of the control of medical professionals. We're sick and won't get better as a species because our surroundings are sick, and there is no intervention for sending a patient back into the soup outside. Speaking of deaths, the death rate overwhelms the birth rate at some point before 2030, And I don't mean in a few countries, which has been the case for many years now. The worldwide death rate instead will overwhelm the net birth rate, and we won't know it for 3 or 4 years after, if ever. I wouldn't be surprised if we've hit this fulcrum at any point since 2020, but it's the steady decline I most care about. This will be the population point where it is clear that general complexity growth isn't sufficient to overcome complexity unraveling. Given that more people have entered famine each year since 2020, more at war, and that disability rates have risen each year, we can already craft a picture of more people at risk. Well, the next step after at risk is risk has hit, and we will, most of us living right now, be this shortly. This prediction will be impossible to identify on anything but a population level due to the pure amount of threats, but I see the population peak as within ±3 years of now 2025. This places us ahead of the limits to growth by a fair amount, and I recognize this. I assert the limits to growth will end up being conservative, even if remarkably prescient. If it helps, I think I'm still being conservative in this document, but I'm trying to wrestle an elephant alone here. Wildlife populations are already permanently in decline. I can state this, and it's not a prediction at all, it's entirely a record. Do you see how predictive that itself is? Here is an actual prediction then. It's not just that animal populations as a whole are in collapse or that species that had been considered stable will collapse shortly. It's that all worldwide populations are already in collapse, and any not appearing to be have simply not be assessed correctly. And here's the kicker. No other species-wide permanent surges will occur at scale in anything but single-celled life. The rise of acidity in waters will not allow an explosion of jellyfish. Bees and wasps will not be expanding their territories, and mosquitoes will not be appearing at scale in Britain and Norway. There are simply too many unaccounted negative forcings acting on each species now, and a free niche is not a niche at all. If there is an absence in an ecosystem, it is because there is no web of life to something there any longer. The very substrates of life are now poisoned or gone, or within years of it. Far from missing species, we have been even more blind to the infinite connections of ecosystem, and have not comprehended that when every threat is under assault, no other system is going to be able to buffer or assist in adaptation. This prediction expands to the plant kingdom as well, though perhaps slightly delayed. Trees will not be expanding to the boreal tundras as they do not move at the speeds the temperature is now shifting. Note, this prediction does not hold universally across locations, but on a system level, the most resilience we'll see are pockets that have bursts of new complexity but are simply delayed in their eventual unraveling. And I would say no more than 15 years. Luckily, there may be pockets of complex life in the deep ocean or sealed in the earth that bucks this trend. But if this prediction seems otherwise severe, let me point out that in many instances populations are functionally extinct already, and that persistence in a pocket is not the same as a thriving species. One of the best bits of evidence for this is that over 120 years after creating the modern concept of the preserve, populations of all animals continue to plummet. There are less African elephants in the same Kenya preserves now than 10 years ago, and the same is true for nearly all protected species. Some quick math from the WWF, 70% of animal life gone in 50 years. That's about 14% a decade, or 1.4% a year. But that's backloaded, or to put otherwise accelerating, so more like 20% in the last decade, which means carrying it forward just one more decade with further growth equal to something like 96% of animals dead by 2035. And that's using their own figures and none of mine. Extinction debt has already claimed most life forms, and we're just not following the math out. We will let each other starve in large numbers 2025 and next year and on. This one surprised me each time I arrive back to it, but at the core, this prediction is the acknowledgement that food aid is largely being cut worldwide. Russia, USA, China are all reducing food aid as of 2025 at the same time that famines are returning. In fact, the famines appeared first, which means governments, or should have, known what they were doing. Global production figures of stable crops are shaky right now, but not falling actively, just not growing. Inventories are reducing, however, so there may be some recognition of instability about. More significant, however, is that as the primary current driver of food instability is inflation plus weather, and yet the root causes of neither are being addressed at scale only within a nation. So less aid plus increasing stressors means that not only does the famine increase next year and after, but that when the famine gets to size to be noticed again, there won't be reserves for addressing it that governments find acceptable to pay for. With everyone already at record debt levels and inventories low, costs to avoid each famine spirals. And even if an individual famine is avoided, aid won't be provided at scale for the necessary 3 to 5 years to build back resiliency, which indeed can't be brought back due to changing weather and disrupted transportation. Worse, because we are allowing more food insecurity inside our own countries when it hits elsewhere, hunger will carry less general weight. Food insecurity will be old news, given the likely fall of Iran and the expansion of attacks on the remains of Palestine, and that the Sudan and Yemeni wars will only expand. 2025 should see a surge of another 150 million or more in hunger at least. And so if we try to look just 5 years away, the trend line shows us likely several billion might be starving, if of course they are still alive. Private equity has been suspected to move into food in a big way over the last 5 to 10 years, buying up mid-sized distributors and farms as well as manipulating markets, and I will predict the infiltration is much larger than suspected. Low food inventories and the ability to buy the few remaining producers versus historical levels is a simple value proposition. See Blackstone's 2x acquisition in 2021 during the pandemic. This makes some farmland now owned by entities with priorities different than food and nationalism, and further price altering will result. I am not saying investment will intentionally crash or short food at scale. Instead, food production and industry will receive much the same inflated interest as homes now do. This is a hallmark of a collapsing society, consolidation from owning factories and hotels and complicated industries to pouring money instead on the simple things, products that still function as infrastructure fails, as in banana republics. Notice the retail and office vacancies that are rising in many countries. But finance and food is going to particularly swell and cause unforeseen consequences. Think of how EA has bought up game companies for their labeling, only to fire studio after studio rather than continue product lines. Only now will be Coca-Cola owning Tyson plus beef plus all the water, and then removing options one by one. The public perception of food is often that when food becomes rarer than it should, governments can step in and make food public. But I think the lessons from Sri Lanka should tell us differently. Now, when a government goes to interfere in food, they will find corporate consolidation has rendered the process impossible to control. Fertilizers come from overseas, seeds come from overseas, and a state cannot seize a company's overseas assets easily. And making an industry from scratch can take decades. Food is now, and when something happens to Morocco or global shipping, or foreign currency reserves, we will see an entire nation descend to food insecurity as all its agricultural industries collapse at once. This is likely at any point now, with several small countries currently suffering, and Brazil or Turkey or Mexico or Egypt or India, all possible next. It is not that food won't be available at first, it is that food will be continually repriced in such a way as to maintain plenty for an increasingly smaller few. Homelessness will explode, of course, and I'd expect 20% YOY growth from now on in any nation. What is still available at the basic income levels will become decreasingly basic, unhealthy, overpriced, fewer options, and already, though, food is one of the most essential items. It is left out of many indexes, letting the rise there be invisible so as to protect regimes. Expect food deserts to soar and grocery chain consolidation to accelerate, and as a result, supply chain issues will continue intermittently from now on worldwide. As food banks reduce locations and offerings, and then finally close, at last populist anger rises and government turnovers become constant in whatever elections remain. Food inequality, anti-establishment riots in cities give way to further authoritarian crackdowns, and of course, local inflation rises that become systemic. The US will especially face overseas shortages in the latter half of 2025, and food inflation worldwide will not be returning to normal again. I generally expect food inflation to track 2 times or more of core CPI almost everywhere. Food is expensive from now on and will never be cheap again. Be aware that food is very much a doom loop scenario. Should Turkey fall out of the food web, any nation depending on Turkey's harvests also fall out. We are experiencing this now with chocolate, coffee production, which majorly come from only a few nations. Expect the same with crops we all take for granted, like lychees, apples, agave, etc. Here's a fun one, at least for the next 3 or 4 years while it still applies. Corporate consolidation will continue. Less and less companies, yes, but also in a strange growing multiverse of fiction. Each time a new entity is absorbed into the Borg of central companies, we'll get more Spider-Man, Darkwing Duck crossovers. We'll get more Usagi Yojimbo in our Tony the Tiger cereal. Humans will cling more and more to a few marketable ideas, letting them mutate only enough to rub against other comfortable ideas inside of controlled playgrounds. If this continues long enough, we'll get Fortnite everywhere. Marvel and DC won't just have a 10-part series of movies. They'll do stage plays with Doctor Who and the Transformers, and a battle royale between every mascot ever. We will have infinite permutations of only a few central ideas, which leads to an observation. I described infinite diversity and infinite combination from pollution, and that's what this idea is too. Combinations escalating fractally, but only in subjects that are comfortable, and with reboots there to pull back to baseline whenever engagement falls. A regeneration we can't manage in real life. How odd. It's almost like we can see the chaos patterns in our fiction, but then not apply them back to reality. I say in part because of bias. Corporate systems have long surpassed many governments in terms of power and influence, even from the lens of per capita engagement. As example, Spain has 50 million citizens, while TikTok has 1.8 billion users. How much does the average person use TikTok? Probably very much less than they use Spain's power and police and roads, etc. But here's the thing, other nations have those things too. So Spain might not be as essential as it thinks. One problem with this is that while a country is nominally controlled by its citizenry, corporations can be multinational and controlled by foreign concerns. This will lead to a complication when nations both fragment internally and fight amongst each other. Coca-Cola might abandon Africa as an example, which doesn't sound bad until we realize most water production facilities there are now Coca-Cola run. And this won't matter to the American company HQ. Starlink will not just abandon Ukraine, and Pornhub won't just abandon France. Instead, Westfarmers will abandon Israel, and Nutrien will abandon Russia. Gazprom is already abandoning Europe, so this has started. But as wars expand and consolidation continues, in just a few years, we're going to see a shipping company abandon the Strait of Hormuz, and all goods will go up 10% everywhere. Because the company isn't controlled except nominally, and because seizing control of that company would cause a shock that a weakened nation can't handle. And if a nation is strong enough to seize a company, it will do so, and cause a shock that hits all the other countries who couldn't. On aerosols, I generally agree with Hansen and Simmons that we've gotten the strength of their cooling wrong. However, I also predict that even Hansen is wrong about how much. In a scenario where we didn't have to worry about any other factors, I still think SO2 aerosols are too complex to accurately calculate to a mean given how much we put out and how widespread their effects are. I know we don't even accurately assess how much of this aerosol we put out, as keeps being evidenced by actual contrail counting or direct ship measurements. And remember, there are more aerosols at scale than just SO2. So how can I predict from this? By attempting accounting for chaos and bias. We have been undercounting more than we've been overcounting. We have assumed better more often than worse. So quick adjustment is that we assume we don't understand these factors, and we're not even done with the full heating of our SO2 reductions yet. We get another burst of localized warming over the Mediterranean in 2026-2027 too, and when pollution is forced to be reduced by power cuts and fuel shortages, we're probably due for 2C+ from just that total aerosol reduction. 1C is the general IPCC estimate of all aerosol forcings, and so we go bigger. Let's see. I have encountered all manner of disturbing predictions on cloud feedbacks, even from my calloused hands. An example, some models suggest at around 1,200 ppm, CO2 most clouds simply vanish from the skies, causing 8C+ of temperature spikes. I'm not sure how that maps to periods like the Cretaceous or Devonian with much higher CO2. All sorts of facts must be wrong here, but what I am certain of is that some CMIP6S were discounted for having higher warming, but also had the best cloud modeling available then. So I'm going to assume there's a cloud feedback, and it's potentially quite high. But more, humans also measure heating as CO2 and CO2 equivalent, but we've gotten both numbers wrong, and we've got an uncertain cloud feedback that depends on those figures. I don't like that math. All these variables to me suggest a crazy chaotic system, so that's what I will predict here. Answers no one saw coming. Results that we can only piece together later and that do not stay constant. The really resilient ridge off the west coast could vanish at any time or solidify much worse. Likewise, the weather resulting from this change will not be what we think. There are simply too many variables. Even if we get some general forecasts we expect, more heat waves or more water, we're going to get them in ways we didn't anticipate. And patterns we can tease out in time will never come, as the system will keep changing. This is fluid dynamics. I remember reading once about thousands of ceratops found in Drumheller with craters caving in their 6 thick skulls. We humans think we have seen weather, and we have not. Hence Cat 6 hurricanes, sure, but also hurricanes in the UK, in the PNW, that somehow managed to push across the equator, or 200 miles inland. We are going to fail as a species before we correctly model the chaos coming in weather and clouds. I am worried about air temperatures, but not as much as you might think. This is the part where you probably expect me to predict 5C in 5 years, yes. Well, I do think we hit 5C and more eventually, but I don't think it's tomorrow. I don't think even 2C as a 12-month running average is tomorrow. I maintain my original whiteboard prediction that 2026-2027 is when 2C starts showing up and then quickly settles in. What worries me most about temps isn't that we can't measure increasing rates, we absolutely can, but because we can't really predict what those rates mean. Say 2C to most people and it doesn't mean shit in significance, and yet everything that's happened to the climate so far is 1.5C or less. We do not as a species understand what little movements over a giant system means, so if by 2030 we're only just dipped into the 2C pond, we'll think, no big deal, yeah. To confuse the understanding even more, I predict heating comes unevenly and in lurches, which at first people will try to tie to specific events and fail, as I think they did in 2023. We'll look for specific feedbacks or thresholds that cause the leaps, but instead miss that the leaps aren't one cause but wobbles in a system with 100 feedbacks, all of which have all been firing for decades and are accelerating more. Don't get me wrong, a bow will make each summer a leap, nuclear war, a temperature threshold pass for the Amazon. All will be noticeable, yet realistically there are now too many strands for us to pull them apart with certainty. So temps go up, and not by. So decade, but something more approaching the year we had in 23/24 again, and then ever faster. My simple math metric is growth rate in EEI equal to growth rate in air temps. I know this is too simple, but to be frank, no one has been measuring EEI right anyway, so I'm not convinced we shouldn't watch one pressure gauge in anticipation of another's movement. Time to reanalyze this machine. When it comes to air temps, I'm also quite worried about the oceans, and specifically the ratio of energy going into the oceans versus the air. Quite unexpectedly for me at least right now, it looks like the oceans are starting to absorb more heat than they did previously, and so air temps should be up more than they are. Good, right. Except I don't trust it, or the mechanism, or that there aren't other thresholds that reverse and boom, we're up. 4C in a year because the oceans have flipped again. I know we spoke of this, but it bears repeating. It is a nightmare possibility. Still, if we follow 2C by 2027, it's not for a year or two after that before I expect temps to really start rising. Think of it this way, whatever sum of forcing you like got us to 2C by 2027. Now add that forcing plus termination shock beginning. I estimated 2C total here before, plus however many GT of methane from permafrost plus hydrate plus BOO plus 2-ish soil feedback equal to additional forcings by 2040. Maybe you want to discount the hydrates and permafrost. Sure, BOO too, okay? Soil feedback is a bit harder to dismiss, but we can say it's small per IPCC. But then even if you want to use 2C by 2030 30 seconds per Hansen, you'll have to consider adding a 5C termination shock before 2040 per LTG. After all, the people are starting to die, and that's because the systems fail beforehand. So super conservative, 2.5C by 2040. But this whole thing has been about how they're wrong, yes, so it'll be more, much more. In my estimates, it'll be closer to an above 3.5C by 2040, but I could see all sorts of numbers here, really. Just one feedback going a single order of magnitude larger than we, though, and we end up with crazy numbers. And after that, there's just little point in estimating. In a systems view, we don't need the heat to kill us. And yes, by the time 2060 hits and the full force of methane firing has started, then everything larger than a microbe is irrevocably dead. But keep in mind that we're in systems mode elsewhere too, which means we get to realize that the heat that's coming isn't universal, it's regional and temporary, i.e. moves through time. So heat waves that specifically melt a spot, like a hydrate or an ice cap, are perfectly possible and will cause giant destabilizations more like explosions than inflation. Similarly, heat waves that kill 1 million people will happen any day now, and power grids will fail permanently when the hardware gets hotter than design constraints, and then we get to see a nation or region gutted. All this by 2027, I say. Maybe then 2C will get a face. Our last years are going to be our most polluted. Well, of course, pollution is probably the top thing killing us. And yet we all know we'll be polluting the most in our last functioning years. We're not going to pull back at the last moment, but still have too much inertia pushing us off the edge. Instead, I predict we'll be accelerating right up until the moment the power turns off. And after that, while pollution as a whole might drop, we'll be busy burning every last tree for warmth, and then we'll burn plastic and metal and each other if needed. The plan only for now driver only gets louder in desperation, and governments are mostly too paralyzed already, and so a good indicator of collapse is that smaller problems that aren't really small get tossed aside. So not only will we keep polluting, I guarantee we pull back on our laws preventing pollution and go all out. To keep lights on and food flowing regulations will fall left and right or be ignored altogether, worldwide. And then when the reactors melt down, we'll be polluting even in absenteeism. COVID never left us and never will. And the interesting thing, since the virus can repeatedly infect and damage us, each infection was just itself a different stage of the same illness in individuals. That means we probably haven't even seen COVID's full form yet, with our artificial antibodies failing to prevent reinfection at scale, though generally stopping severe disease. We have engineered a scenario where repeated damage to immune and epithelial systems, i.e. all of them, means we jump the evolutionary war straight to becoming like some bat population, sick and dying our whole lives. Just COVID alone does this to our race, and if everything else were fine, I'd still expect a noticeable difference in population health and mortality levels before and 20 years after COVID. Sufficient biotech might get us out of this at any point, but more likely COVID makes a few more mutations by 2030, and instead we get a continual degrading stress on hospitals, daily healthcare workers. No steady sickness here, but only active decline, with hospitals and medical services having peaked worldwide before the pandemic, not any time after it. And all of this ignores a nightmare mutation like we're waiting for with avian flu, the sort of thing to really drive home our stupidity with defunded research and pandemic preparations. Industry worldwide is going to remain fully coiled with fossil fuels right until the end. This means industrial outputs only truly stops at scale when oil stops flowing, and not from the wells, but from between refineries and markets. A green revolution will never exist at scale, and most numbers that point toward it are self-reported by the same folks that said their wells put out 1/7 of the methane that they actually released. Green electricity may give us a bit more reach, but as an example, the hydro dams in Washington state would all fail in a day without diesel and gas. The workers couldn't get to them, the part replacements they require couldn't be shipped, the trees couldn't be cleared, etc. And if we get that one system working, we used every electric vehicle to do it. We don't have enough rare metals to get us to even one full generation of full green power inside of 200 years, about how long it would take to get enough copper plus graphite together, and not because we don't have the minerals, but the remaining growth capacity. And so we're not going to magically pass 30% renewables as the whole energy system, including transport, food, materials, as well as power, inside of 5, 10, or even 15 years. Instead, I don't see us getting any real resilience expansion here at all. If anything, the brittleness of newer, and thus more network-integrated technologies is going to expose us to even more overseas disruptions. Think the CrowdStrike outage, and you start to see that a diesel truck is going to be needed when the Tesla doesn't start. We are going to have to fire up the old gas guzzlers even at 150 barrel, if only because the processors and the solar panels and the very wiring are all made elsewhere, and we need a local solution. Debt is a problem, and it will have physical consequences in paralyzing those last moments we might act. Perhaps the best way to understand debt as a problem is to recognize how everyone says it is, and yet can't ever agree as to when. That means debt itself is a mammoth conservative bias, a unified delusion that something bad might happen somewhere but not soon, so fuck it, let's keep going. Given that debt is mostly theoretical, a mass agreement of humans, I've often been tempted to agree that maybe huge debt-wise okay when compared to microplastics. But no, this is a systems analysis. And that means debt is also planning and information, and its expectations are resiliency for some functional parts of the economy. And that means debt is going to be a problem too, and likely a problem before lots of other things are. It makes sense. It's hard to pay attention to something like debt when you've not eaten, sure, but your landlord who has eaten still cares. This pattern means I would put the debt strand before a lot of the LTG indicators, but still there is an accelerant like populism or a control system. For other systems like paralyzed governance, and perhaps the biggest proof of this placement is that debt exploded worldwide just as ROI started to diminish, i.e., the late 60s and early 70s. I often find it useful to view debt as an attempt to expand complexity now, when other realities aren't allowing it. Once upon a time, we might expand operations by assimilating capacity in the form of cheap oil or new territories or unconquered markets, but now instead we just grow debt with less and less connection to stuff. Well, I don't think anyone anywhere has our debt system truly mapped out. See the rise of shadow banking and PE markets, and that makes debt just such a strong example of why I first needed my heuristic. Of note here is that countries all over the world have been collectively talking about their debt, or even trying to tamp it down. At the same, we have the largest number of incumbent wins in the history of democracies 2024. Likewise, nearly all major market classes are fluxing up and down, while trade wars and actual wars expand. Debt was one of the glues we used to drive mediocre growth figures for the last 5 years, and yet the IMF has just now warned that the 2020s look set for the worst worldwide growth since the 1960s. Do you see the patterns of convergence again? What happens next is that some nations continue to pile on their debt, hoping any growth overwhelms concerns about its weakness, while other nations attempt to tighten their belts. Unfortunate, both groups are missing the point. At the same time, they'll be trying for light growth or no growth. What they truly need is record growth to overcome rising stressors. They need new infrastructure to replace what was just destroyed this year. They need things they've never had, like seawalls and high-speed rail and solar power to prevent oil shocks and drought stress. But no one is planning that sort of expansion, and even the growth we had for the last 5 years was all artificial. And we know this because so few physical projects have been done. This is my general assertion here. Not that the future looks like stagflation or degrowth, though both happen, but that in fact the recent past has been an illusion as well. The reason Chinese home prices have fallen 4 years in a row, the reason there are more homeless than ever, the reason the populist parties are rising is that the real economic picture, divorced from debt and corporate lying and unequal distribution, is that the vast majority have been getting poorer and more debt-ridden year by year. Industrial output was never the best measurement because plastic toys consumption got mixed in with freeways infrastructure. And we haven't been building freeways for 2 generations at least. I assert GDP per capita has been dropping for years already, and we just used illusionary money to confuse ourselves with growth narratives that are now flickering. Inflation seems a good phenomenon for some to blame, but in reality, increasing cost of stability once that's inflation. And in fullness, it's the stability we've lost, and when it's seen that governments or companies or individuals dawn, have it either. Bonds will flicker now, crash some now, and money will pour out of nations accelerating from now. There will be no winners here is my guess, or maybe 1 or 2 as ivory towers. I'd expect those institutions that can best lie, maintain illusion to succeed, with tech and base resource companies surging as more people double down while so much else crashes. There has been some assumption that the wealthy, hoarding all their resources, have plans or awareness most of us lack. Maybe even they have a conspiracy of control or an escape out of this mess. This is all just hopeful nonsense. The truth is that many of the ultra-wealthy do have bunkers, but that's it, and even the bunkers aren't the answer or even really for the right reason. The wealthy can see chaos, but they imagine castles and command and control centers, when in truth shortly there's nothing that will be left and nowhere Earth-like they'll be able to emerge out to. I'm not even sure how a bunker can protect you from microplastic accumulation and chemical exposures. Seems a place to concentrate them inside yourself to me. In the end, we are humans with human-level understanding, and all the corporate apparatus in the world to feed to the wealthy is the problem and not the solution. We will not be escaping to Mars. There are no underground cities that will survive for long, and there is no secret plan to save enough of anyone. Geoengineering will be attempted and yet never scaled up. We can't scale up proven technologies like forestation or recycling given decade time spans, and we do not have that now. Of some interest, however, I do quite expect the wealthy to get wealthier even during degrowth, and short of populist uprisings they will run for office, suggest and try to implement radical but easy solutions, and generally muddy the waters with power grabs and infighting. Have you noticed we've already had competing billionaire candidates? There will be no large sustained international movements based around sudden clarity. In fact, I don't believe any societies at scale are going to even have a moment of clarity. In disaster management, there is also a concept of normalcy bias, and most studies seem to suggest that in an extraordinary moment, many people fail to conceptualize new reality even worse than in their baseline. Now imagine our stressed individual is also sick from long COVID in that moment, undernourished, and already distrustful of government. Is that person more or less likely to have the biological capacity to tease out a safe path through a complicated scenario? Likewise, think of a government, bloated to largest size ever due to population, but also recently new to office thanks to another in a series of upset elections. So individuals without prior government experience in charge of a government at its all-time largest or close to it. Would we expect a more nuanced understanding of a rapid situation from this person, or a simpler one? Now, simple absolutely does not mean stupid, but please compare to my own heuristic. Small rules in practice, yes, but to clarify its success, took a multi-domain approach rarely seen. If we just applied the heuristics and just say climate science, it would look ridiculous and be much better expressed as mathematics or even just a few small model calibrations. Some expression infinitely more complicated, but that would be useless at spotting the same phenomena is happening in human health, governance, and ocean dynamics. So what happens when mysterious downward spikes are showing up in academic tests, record numbers of refugees are building up at borders, and reports of record disaster losses build up? Will those be synthesized into one picture? No, none are directly addressed, and we focus on one or two things like normal. I don't think that New York flooding suddenly starts an international conversation on a complexity crisis. Yes, it might start everyone talking about geoengineering. It might even cause some attempts to be trialed, and yet no one will be. Noting how sulfur seeding at scale simply spreads another pollutant to now be mixed with the PFOS and microplastics and lack of animals in empty niches. Solving one problem in isolation does not fight the cascade of them, and like semaglutides may simply add new complexity to a system rather than repair existing complexity. So here's the full prediction. The worse things get, the muddier the picture for us all, not the better. It isn't just biological systems stressed now, but also academic and information systems. And no internet, libraries without funding, government databases closing, all mean less information for any team to work with. There will be no greater synthesis at scale because we didn't notice before, and now our mechanisms for noticing are degraded. Yes, there will be more pressure to figure situations out, but when the answer is there is no effective answer, humans will resist synthesis even more. We will silo, pick one or two problems as the problem, and more than likely try to scapegoat even that. This will be most obvious when different nations pick different problems, or when the few interventions we do implement completely fail to address the issue. More guards at the border doesn't stop millions of people fleeing death behind them. Do not expect a conference that puts everything together. There will be no Manhattan projects for a multi-system problem because we couldn't do the domain synthesis when it was easy. Now it'll be hard. There are places on Earth where the refugee population is already 20% or more of the nation. This will be a feedback, with refugees fleeing both single events as well as collapsing societies accelerating the next nation's collapse. And interestingly, thanks to geography, we have at least a sense of likely progression. After all, there are only so many ships in the world. I would expect Turkey and Greece, and to some extent Armenia, Ukraine, and Spain to especially suffer, and any of them as likely as next to fall nations. Like California cities in Dust Bowl years, when camps get large or widespread enough, expect governments to lose control of regions in a tide that very well could be like dominoes falling. There are hints of this now. Cuba has lost 10% of its population in about 8 years, and there are likely 7+ million Afghanis illegally in Pakistan. Greece, Italy, Macedonia, Romania have all had or threatened far-right governments worried about refugees, and France and Germany too. But all of this has just been from a few small national failures, Syria and Afghanistan and Eritrea. What will happen when a large nation fails? Pakistan and Iran are almost certainties, but others might be Bangladesh, Mexico, Bolivia, Colombia, and Egypt. When populations at that size flee, 1 million refugees might show up to a border within a few weeks. One of two scenarios seems most likely then. Either the refugees overwhelm the guards and make entrance, or the guards manage to force the refugees back. But how does one stop 1 million people, or more? At some point, raw brutality likely needs to be used, and here's another feedback. Brutality means training your army to attack civilians. It also means more protests within your nation. This gives more reasons to crack down more refugees. Regimes attacking civilians is a cycle that gets more civilians to flee, leaving nations that crack down more secure in the moment, yes, but it also means that nations that do no crackdown risk becoming overwhelmed as a safe port. There is some sign of this already, with the US seen as a destination while autocratic regimes are avoided. And so here's the prediction. Increasingly, we will now see either a constant vigilance of brutality that tries to seal borders, or nations too porous to prevent non-stop influx until their society is overwhelmed. And back to geography, not all borders are created equal. I don't anticipate there is anything Turkey could do to seal itself. The same with the Russia, China, India, or Brazil. There is some possibility of the US managing, but only if Mexico can assist and so stays functional. Reality will become even more chaotic, however, when we consider migration and fleeing within a nation. Consider Paradise CA still has not recovered, and many Chico hotels still have survivors. And unlike previous internal migrations now, there will be increasingly more in number, from larger regions, and devastated by shock events at speed. The time between shocks will be shorter too, and even now some areas are being flooded 2 or 3 times in a single year. As soon as climate chaos permanently destroys enough of a nation's infrastructure, at that point I predict it is cities that will have to be sealed rather than borders. There will be too many in need, and so again we end up with a situation like South Africa. I believe a real accounting of refugees today would find they have non-linearly surged since 2022 at least, and are many tens of millions more than officially accounted. Expect increasing complaints to the UN, border closures as measured by mileage to surge, and the first military attack on a refugee camp outside of Myanmar and Israel likely occurs any time now. Governments worldwide will increase refugee crackdowns, and yet still find numbers rising. Populism isn't done spreading or doubling down. Expect the number of populist candidates to rise worldwide, but there will be some surprises to the World War II formula. Firstly, while populist candidates might win, I would expect them to quickly lose as well. Populism is simply easy answers, and we now are in a world where the easy abroad answers aren't effective. Nations are more equal and intertwined. Wars are more expensive and don't function with nuclear arms. If a government can't produce results like Hitler or Mussolini quickly did in their rises, then I expect the public can turn on them as well. And while the internet allows candidates from nowhere, it hasn't built strong party support too. Yes, so with less international foes available and less robust apparatus, I'd expect populism to focus even more than before on alienation. Immigrants, trans, gays, different ethnic groups all become enemies and unifying points. Trans legislation will follow the classic ladder of ban from sports, bathrooms banned from government registered with government isolated from society worse. Refugees, as they rise quickly, will have it even worse. And punishing people will look like taking action. Destroying government norms and attack will be the only real capability of populism, and both will be feedbacks, with nations targeting their own populations and casting refugees to their neighbors, who will likewise crack down and so on. This continues until either militaries fall or are toppled by a critical mass of people, like in Bangladesh, however temporarily. This will be perhaps the most dangerous human tipping point of the next 10 years. I give no government longer than that. The reality for everyone is that we're already past peak resource extraction, and our spaghetti meal of problems can't be attacked with weaponry. So how do nations collapse? We don't need to imagine here. Again, we're starting to see it already. South Africa sits with government paralyzed and infrastructure failing, with enclaves formed around the wealthy, where many services still exist, generators, private security, etc., while everyone else just makes do best they can, but still degrading. In Venezuela and Cuba, some cities remain with power mostly on, but the countryside is often dark. Conversely, Ecuador's government remains functional, but 24 months of no rain means no power, but for the most important places. And think, Venezuela's collapse meant Cuba couldn't buy from them. In these partial collapses is when populism threatens most, as efforts push tentpole campaigns think the Holocaust expanding even as Germany loses its wars. Here's what I expect. In the US, there will be an overreach of executive power to the point of a third term, and/or a declaration of martial law and military rule. Trump never set out to be a dictator, and yet neither did Hitler. And yet look what victory after victory does to goalposts. Refugees will overwhelm Mexico from within and without, and gang violence is entrenched enough there to pull the government fully apart inside of a bad year. Australia's shores will be impossible to close, and the nation will be overwhelmed as soon as Indonesia falls. Until 2028, I do expect the majority of nations to proceed most like the UK, a series of ever more powerless governments and a relentless eroding of standards of living. First world nations that have fought off populism so far, like Canada, France, Germany, Japan, all may have to accept a stark and startling rise to problems and lack of answers for a few years, and then proceed from there. I would expect new failed nations every year now, and a steady erosion everywhere towards national, regional, local, and neighborhood governments only. Like Haiti, by 2030, it'll be your block versus everyone else for the majority of Earth. I have some general sea predictions that don't quite all need their own specific section, so here goes. The loss of marine life plus the failure of international governance will mean Chinese ships, even more, at scale crossing waters and causing incidents. As fish farms in the water become more dangerous, there will be outbreaks and taintings of fish-related products and a general collapse of fish available. This is happening now and at scale within a few years. No fish, of course, means rising hunger and more fish farming, and yet reliable zones are already vanishing, adding to food inflation and shortages. I expect a minimum of sea increase in ocean heat by 2027, and likely more. This likely means the tongue of Thwaites is gone entirely 2026, and ocean currents are right now different than calculated. Luckily, ocean currents don't just stop. Still, like a worm stuck in the middle, we will miss when the currents flail about at the ends. A statistical analysis of multiple ocean currents today would show across the board weakening or drift, and I expect in the new few years we'll discover a major current has already changed its general flow path in the past 2 decades. Coral life forms will be mostly extinct before 2030, and just as bad a full accounting of 2024-25 will find the crisis in Galicia and Alaskan. Fisheries and inhering populations in the North Atlantic and the algae blooms in Kangaroo Island are all statistically common events now, not actually exceptional, but only here in our attention. The oceans will not be stabilizing, unfortunately, and ocean tours will continue long past the point where every natural harbor and snorkeling site has gone quiet. I have a specific prediction about the future that I do not see described as a planetary danger, but is, namely in the disseminated nature of network dysfunction. Resilience is often talked about as an exercise for communities or individuals, or occasionally, like in Finland, a national priority. Our heuristic suggests such efforts might misunderstand resilience entirely. Example, New Zealand and Australia, 2 of the richest and yet most isolated of the major nations, both with small populations with a history of radical resilience. And I will tell you what anyone in the outback surely knows, that both nations will fall quickly in the next 10 years. Unfortunately, no one I know of has bothered to map out the full connections between nations at scale, let alone their magnitudes. This is an error. Some examples: 50% of adults currently have a prescription medication, 70% of the phosphorus fertilizer in the world comes from Morocco, 80% of all chemical precursors come through China, 70% of all generic medications come from India. So here is a prediction. Resilience at scale is a myth anymore. When Australia and New Zealand were sealed off from the world during COVID, ships were still arriving to both constantly. And if those ships ever did stop, both countries would immediately need to revert to no medications, no fertilizers, and no advanced manufacturing. Populations would plummet inside of a year, if not even less, and keep in mind both nations produce more than enough food to feed themselves in one harvest. But with no fertilizer, there would only be one harvest and no others. Unlike the myth of animals thriving in collapsed environments, I assume humans are just as vulnerable as any other life form. Only our technology alone has let us persist through the anthropogenic extinction so far. But when technology starts to fail, we will fail too. And today technology is inherently based around the network. Imagine, if Microsoft goes offline, how many nations will lose central access to almost everything they do? When cloud services go down, is there a local server to maintain functioning for pharmacies? The disseminated dysfunction prediction at its core is that damage is going to spread across the network of technology faster than anticipated. And that this damage will come with physical consequences that feed back and create more dysfunction, but at network speeds. The CrowdStrike outage is a perfect example. One error in one location cascaded across the world, causing billions of dollars of damage in a single day. And this was a systemic within realm of functioning error. What does cascading physical error without repair look like? It's not that one nation will lose plane flights, it's that whole continents will, maybe the planet, and all at once. When command and control for a satellite network goes down, so will every system that uses that service right. The nature of managed services as a component of industry was that parts of the process can be managed by someone else somewhere else. And get this, we've even disseminated knowledge. I have seen this at scale, with IT services 1,000 miles away from the location, where the only knowledge of how to do something sitting in a wiki or a database and not in a written file, or even as an AI irreplaceable service that exists solely in the bowels of us, West 1, out in the fields of Yakimawa. I ask, do you believe in power outages? That's all it takes for AI services to go down and knowledge to not be available, and remember all the workers were fired. Who do you get for when that service goes down? I suggest for that moment we don't even go back to 1980. We go back to 1780 because we forgot how 1980 works. When India goes down, American support services stop and can't be scaled back up immediately. When AI services in China go down, hotels, customer service, and trading worldwide suffer and don't function. Cascade will spread farther than anticipated in human systems entirely because we have designed disseminated human systems. There are only 200 major data centers in the world. Do you see how this is more fragile than 8 billion individuals? Such a node-light network plunges either in just a few hits or even all at once, and maybe some small amounts of it could be adjusted to function locally, but all the capacity of before. No, we either revert quickly to 1980 or we lose capabilities entirely not to return. And fast. Think of just New York. If there is no Wall Street, where does capital flow? Who knows who owes what to whom and can lend to everyone else? Suddenly everyone in the world has the same problem, and they must all now overcome this dysfunction together. If they weren't linked, they wouldn't have this problem, but now people have more problems when there is chaos, not less. I view this as the nervous system in a life form. Yes, in theory, the liver is fine if the brain dies. But in practice, there will be no food, no oxygen, no coordination of any kind at scale. We can argue about resiliency for the remaining 15%, the approximate population before fertilizer and antibiotics medications, but we'll likely have to plummet from now to 15% first. The last one. So far, all of these predictions we've made are just mostly from known quantities, systems we're aware of and dynamics we at least have some sense of. Now keep in mind that these are not the only systems on Earth. We live on a very large stage and a black swan or shock event could happen at any time. Avian flu seems much more of a when than a maybe. Likewise, a magnetic pole fluctuation or a Carrington event could at any time hit Earth. Asteroids, supernovas, volcanoes, and pure human accident could all be added to our situation at any time. This is why you keep a system stable, so it can absorb hits better. But right now it's hard to see how such an event wouldn't just push weak systems even faster towards disintegration. Along these lines, there is a threat I've generally kept on its own, though it is in no way special. It is in fact as predictable as the others at a systems level, but it's also so concentrated as a force multiplier that it's difficult to see just how its application plays out. But we'll still try. More populist leaders, more conflict both within and without a society, more resource shortages, more climate immigrants, more polarization, and more attempts. For easy answers means the deterrence equation of nuclear arms that the world has relied on will be continually eroded until they are likely to be used. Keep in mind in particular that sicker individuals with more cognitive difficulties means more acceptance and use of easy answers, and nukes are quite easy, that's their point. I wouldn't expect full exchanges between large powers as long as those powers remain cohesive and aren't in direct conflict. I do think most people understand conceptually that nukes mean mass death even if that risk seems far away, and so the first risks are nations with weapons using them on nations without. Israel defending itself, Russia turning the tide of its war, China bringing Taiwan to surrender. I consider all of them likely. Along the same lines as chaos rises and regimes fall, the use of a nuclear weapon on a fallen nation makes much more sense as forced application of order, even just as a demonstration. But I don't think these scenarios stay lonely for long. Nuclear weapons between nations starts to make the most sense when the nation itself is crumbling and deteriorating, and a denial of this is needed. A doubling down towards our enemies aren't ourselves. This would be the eruption of Pakistan and India, or the US and China, or Russia and Europe. I could see these escalating quickly once real weakness sets in on either party, or when a new enemy is quickly identified. But by far the largest immediate risk of nuclear action is when a nation itself falls apart and balkanizes, becomes incoherent. Then a weapon or several could be used against itself, its neighbors, whomever. as nations themselves change the calculus between friend and foe, and threat is rewritten on the fly, and often will come with very little time to think, plan, maneuver. Why not use a nuke if it seems your regime is short? Why not hold others hostage? Add to this the reality of nuclear power plants, poor maintenance, and falling supply chains. Many nuclear reactors cannot simply be shut down without significant preparation, and there is nothing special protecting these technological nodes as networks and governance fail. This means there will be accidents, unintentional meltdowns, and eventually a cascade of them. Most active reactors have long lived past their planned lives, and so expect a disaster in slow motion in a few instances. Reports of a plant in danger over and over, but saved just like Zaporizhzhia. Yes, but also of single points of failure highlighted but never made secure. Supply issues, personnel issues, constantly changing hands between warring factions all might result, and then a leak, raised radiation levels, or a bomb or two in the facility causing damage. And then a meltdown or large release. More than one will happen shortly, and when a nation of size falls, these will blister out over potentially thousands of kilometers. That will be a sign of a dead country not to return. And when any nuclear nation falters, keep in mind we get a USSR-2, a free-for-all to grab weapons, nuclear material, etc., and make it vanish. Only last time this occurred, the nations with the weapons were still largely cohesive in terms of population and health and technology. The power stayed on, phones worked, and still we couldn't account for weapons for decades or ever. Now even those basic tools might not be so reliable. One final bit to this. I would not expect anyone to know the real results of a large exchange, whatever many others have said. Our heuristics hint such an exchange isn't modelable even on a low-resolution big-picture scale. This many lost to fallout, this many months of dust, misses the point that the Earth system being modeled in such scenarios is in actuality different than now. No one knows what fallout does to microplastics that already coat the world. No one knows how methane hydrates respond to forceful erratic vibrations at scale, and for days, no one knows how a food system already suffering capacity problems can function in both nuclear winter and already existing supply chain issues. This is like trying to map past 2040. I'm not sure there's a point. Even if we survive the radiation, all the other threats will likely still be active right there too. EOF. So, there we have it. A lot of this document is unprecedented, I know, but so is Israel attacking Iran and Iran resisting Israel. So is 120F in the PNW. So is Canada being threatened by its closest ally. So is no bugs on the windshield, losing glaciers in most elections since 2000. And as a point, I didn't even go through all that we could. I have left things out like wet bulb temps, or AI disruption of society, or how reward reinforcement works. So there's even more, isn't there? I think it's time you all admit it was worse than you thought then, and worse than you know now. And I implore you, don't just trust me or anyone else. Look, research, question everything, and keep doing it forever. There is more we could say about everything, so much more, but I'm tired now. If you do want more, you'll have to build it yourself or come find me. And if I'm wrong, please do better and share it. Disclaimer, I don't like 2030 as well, anything. It has no significance to me, and the particular year nor number don't have any importance. Nothing specific happens in 2030, but I did think making predictions for the next 5 years is useful, and from 2025 that puts us at 2030. There is no single threshold crossed in 2030, and it isn't too terribly different than the years before or after. The rate of change is big around then, sure, and accelerating, but that's just how every year will be now. Using 2030 at all is more instead saying, if we're likely to start dying by 2040 according to LTG, then what happens before death? It's easy to say things will be worse than we think, but what does that look like? If there's something we're avoiding thinking about, that we have a bias towards, what does it look like when we remove that bias? What if we refuse to be afraid of our numbers and look right at the future they promise? 2030 is the road to collapse, and you are on the road. Johnny Silverhands, June 24th, 2025. Fin 300th plus. Please follow and comment over on Johnny Silverhands' Substack and enjoy the Anthropocene, ladies and gents. Time is up. Dr. Mark Benecke. Sunshine, ice cream, and postDOOM. Don't feel ashamed to seek professional help. We're only human. Robocop.